Are we really losing cricket matches because we aren't running between wickets? We aren't running enough, we aren't rotating strikes and accumulating a lot of dot balls? That is a narrative that's been going around for a while with this Indian women's team, and that is exactly what we are going to answer if this is the case to begin with. Now, since the last T20 World Cup, we'll be looking at a couple of series, one against Australia, South Africa and two against England. Now, I also know they did play the West Indies and Sri Lanka in between, but no disrespect to them, our focus is going to be on Indian team playing against the bigger teams that we might potentially lose against in this World Cup, and to see if dot balls and running between wickets and non-boundary strike rates and all of that is the reason why we are losing. This is going to be a very fun video because the investigation has a lot of interesting findings. Let's start off with the first series that we played this year, which was against Australia and which we won 2-1. When you look at the overall numbers, this is where the running between wickets argument becomes a little more interesting. Because when you look at the strike rate, the averages and the dot ball percentages, the Indian team are better than the Australian team. They were better throughout the series, except for one metric, and that's the non-boundary strike rate. Now, these are metrics I will talk about time and again, so if you don't know what non-boundary strike rate is, it's basically the strike rate of a batter if you remove all the boundaries, which indicates how well they're able to rotate strikes. So the Australian team having a better non-boundary strike rate says something, or in this series it really doesn't, because even though their overall non-boundary strike rate is better, we just outworked them and won them over in the power play itself. Because when you look at the power play numbers, Australia just couldn't match the Indian team. We were better in every metric, including the non-boundary strike rate. And this is where things get a little more interesting, because in this series, if you look at the middle phase of the T20 innings, that's the over between 7 and 15, the Indian team was no better than the Australian team except for their average. The Australian team struck more, they had a better dot ball percentage, they had a better non-boundary strike rate, but even through this all, the Indian team, because of how dominant they were in the power play, we just won the series. But there are a couple of player trends to keep in mind. Shefali Verma had a dot ball percentage of 45% and a non-boundary strike rate of 54. Now, these are very disappointing numbers. Now, if you compare Harmanpreet Kaur to Shefali Verma, Harmanpreet Kaur looks impressive because she has a dot ball percentage of 38 and a non-boundary strike rate of 62. But that being said, there's a very funny storyline with Harmanpreet Kaur in this video because her overall numbers are quite decent, but then when you zoom in further, that is where the problem really lies. Because when you now look at Harmanpreet Kaur in the middle phase of the T20 innings, in this series, she had the worst non-boundary strike rate and the worst dot ball percentages. Again, overall numbers look decent, but when you really need her the most in the middle phase of a T20 innings, she doesn't step up. At least she didn't step up in this series. I say that because from Australia, the Indian team traveled down to South Africa, where we were demolished, but again, quite few interesting trends. We're on our way to 1,000 subscribers on this very new channel. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and get us to 1,000 subscribers as soon as possible. Don't forget, we lost the series 4-1 and we lost in all metrics that you can possibly think of. These are the overall numbers, and there is no competition between the two teams because the South African team clearly dominated. Also, why they won the series 4-1. What is interesting in this is the fact that the similarity between the Australian series and South Africa, where we beat the Australian team in the power play, the South African team did the same thing to us in the power play. Not only did we struggle to get wickets because they averaged 142 in the power play, they also struck at more than 150, had a dot ball percentage of just 35 and a non-boundary strike rate of 58. These are goated numbers. Now, when it comes to the middle phase, we had a slightly better average and a slightly better strike rate, but again, we were lost with the dot ball percentages and non-boundary strike rates. Also, if it's just slightly better and if the numbers in the power play are so different, you've already lost the game. But again, player trends, and this is why we continue talking about the two players specifically, and that's Shefali Verma, who again has a dot ball percentage of 38 and a non-boundary strike rate of 56. Again, these are concerning numbers, but this is where we come back to the captain. She again, in theory, has better numbers than Shefali Verma because she has a dot ball percentage of 30% and a non-boundary strike rate of 69.5, close to 70. This time around, however, in the middle phase, she averaged 56 with a strike rate of 140. And no, her dot ball percentages and non-boundary strike rates weren't the worst. In fact, it was one of the best in the series. Yet, we lost 4-1. And you may ask why. Of course, our bowlers, and that is a reason in itself. But then when we come back to the power play numbers and look at the players especially the Indian players who batted in the power play, you won't be surprised. Because when you look at the dot ball percentages and the non-boundary strike rates, the top 4 worst players in this series are all Indians. 4 of them Indians, 2 of the middle order batters with Jemmy and Harmanpreet, of course number 3 and 4. But more importantly, you also have the openers in this case, which was a major problem in this series. The fact that not only were the openers not scoring a lot of runs, they were just consuming a lot of dot balls and not running between wickets. So right, we have lost against South Africa 4-1, but before we go to England, there are a couple of things we have noted. Is the fact that India's overall non-boundary strike rate almost seems the worst as compared to the two teams, yet we won against Australia and we lost against South Africa. Do things change against England this time around? I don't know what to tell you because the story is quite similar to the one against South Africa. Because when you look at the overall numbers, once again, we don't have the better average, we don't have the better strike rate, we don't have the better dot ball percentage or the better non-boundary strike rate. The England team, again, did it all against us. But what is interesting is the fact that we won against England in the power play. We do have better numbers. We average 32, we strike at 150, our dot ball percentage is in the 40s. Of course, a non-boundary strike rate is where we lose again. But if you look at the overall numbers, we still are better than them in the power play. But this time around, we didn't go on to win the series. And that is because of how much better the middle order of the England team were as compared to the Indian batters. Because in the middle phase of the T20 innings, the England batters struck at more than 150, averaging 81. But that's not it with them. It's not just the strike rate and the averages. It's the fact that the dot ball percentage was half of India's in this phase. They just had a dot ball percentage of 16, whereas India had a dot ball percentage of 33. And even the non-boundary strike rate, they didn't rely a lot on their boundaries. The England team had a non-boundary strike rate closing in on 90 in the middle phase, whereas the Indian team was stuck in the 60s once again. And unfortunately, even though Yashtika Bhatia was the highest run scorer in the series across both teams, she was one of the culprits for why we have such disappointing numbers in the middle phase. Because not only did she have the highest dot ball percentage in the middle phase, she had the lowest non-boundary strike rate across two teams. And guess who is second on the list? Unfortunately, it's the Indian captain Harmanpreet Kaur. And even a strike rate at this point isn't helping. Yashtika Bhatia had a strike rate of 74 in the middle phase, whereas Harmanpreet Kaur just had a strike rate of 120. This series was a real example for why running between wickets is important, because it wasn't about the boundaries. The Indian team overall in this series hit more boundaries than them. The Indian team had 70 boundaries in total, whereas the England team had 64. This was clearly down to us being able to do whatever it took between the balls we hit boundaries as a batter. I've come to the last series of this here. But remember how we won a series against England in England last year around just before the ODI World Cup? Well, the story was quite similar with numbers, yet we won that series. Right, so they weren't entirely similar, but if you look at the overall numbers, we did have the better strike rate, average and dot ball percentage. But again, the non-boundary strike rate against this England team last year was still worse. But this was basically down to the bigger difference between the power play and the middle phase and everything that we have gone over anyways. Even though we had the worst non-boundary strike rate, almost identical dot ball percentages and just inferior strike rotation, we won the series not only because the Indian bowlers did extremely well, especially Sri Charani, but it was also because our average was massively high and our strike rates were better in these two phases. I say this, but ironically though, our non-boundary strike rate across these phases are still worse than England's. But more than average and strike rate, where we were really far more superior was the boundary count. Because the Indian team hit 124 boundaries in total as compared to England, who just hit 85. So at that point, the non-boundary strike rate and dot ball percentages don't really matter. So right, we have covered a lot of series. We have talked about non-boundary strike rates and dot ball percentages again and again. What does this mean? Is the hypothesis that a lot of people talk about really true? Because this Indian team does have a universal problem. Across all of these series, at no point do we have a better non-boundary strike rate, which isn't a surprise. But it's not the entire reason for our losses, because we did manage to win against Australia in Australia. We did manage to beat England in England last year. The problem is when we lose a series, it almost so happens that our Indian batters just stop performing together. Because against South Africa and England this year, not only did we have the worst non-boundary strike rate, we also had the worst overall strike rate and the worst dot ball percentage. So what does this really mean? We are winning matches, we are losing matches, the non-boundary strike rates are a mix anyways. It's not down to the team, it's down to players and the trends that you see. We spoke about Shefali Verma. Now, across series or positions, conditions, her non-boundary strike rate and dot ball percentages are very, very identical. It's not a surprise that she's heavily dependent on a boundary count, but the problem is that apart from that, she really isn't doing much to the scoreboard. Then you have Smriti Mandana, who already has a problem with rotating strike and non-boundary strike rates, even though the numbers aren't as high. When you compare her to batters from around the world, her numbers are quite high. And we've made an entire video on this on another channel, so if you haven't checked that out, go check that out. And then you have Harmanpreet Kaur, where overall, like I said, her numbers look quite decent, but when you look at her numbers in the phase that we really need her, that's the overs between 7 and 15, her strike rates are quite bad, her averages are quite bad, her non-boundary strike rates and dot ball percentage are even worse. Now that is the problem with this Indian team. Do the Indian team have a problem with rotating strike? For sure. I mean, the fact that we don't have a better non-boundary strike rate than any other team from last year says something. Apart from Sri Lanka and West Indies that I haven't counted, of course. But it's not the team overall, because if you look at someone like a Jemima Rodriguez, her non-boundary strike rates and dot ball percentages across these series are excellent. In fact, they're elite. I mean, look at these numbers in front of you. The only team that she struggled against in terms of non-boundary strike rate is South Africa, and even that is 69. She's an excellent batter who can rotate strike very well. So it's not a team issue, it's just couple of batters, especially batters who we really need them, and especially in a combination like Smriti and Shefali, who are both openers, both struggle to rotate strike. And then you have someone like a Harmanpreet Kaur who needs to accelerate in the middle phase, but again she just simply struggles rotating strike. So if she's not getting those boundaries, you know the Indian team is in a really big trouble. And that has been our video and the findings from our investigation. If you've enjoyed this video, like, share and subscribe, all that good stuff. All of the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.